Let's turn over to panentheism, and that's the worldview that we can't confuse with pantheism. It's often confused with it. It has several names by which it goes by. It's dipolar theism, processism or organicism, neoclassical theism. Process theology really finds panentheism as its basis. You can look at Alfred North Whitehead, Schubert Ogden, John Cobb, Lewis Ford. These process theologians usually buy into some form of this panentheism to support their view that God is in process and growing and evolving. But notice this worldview here. It's a mixture of theism and pantheism. It's actually like a halfway house between theism, the belief that there's a transcendent and immanent God, and the view that God is all and all is God, and pantheism. And we'll see why here. They believe in a personal God that has two poles, or two aspects to him. There's an infinite pole, or spirit, otherwise known, beyond the physical universe, and a finite pole, which is God's body, which is the universe. And to articulate this, so I don't lose you here, this pole in God, or these two poles in God, so I call them dipolar theism. You have what you call a potential pole here, and then on the other side here you have what you call an actual pole. So God is bipolar or dipolar. The potential pole is eternal. The potential pole is also infinite. It's unchanging. And also it's spirit, so to speak, there. And it's God's can-be-ness. Okay? It's his potential, what he can be. And this potential is infinite. It's eternal. There's no limits or stopping point at what God can achieve and grow and know. Though he actually is not here yet in the eternal, infinite, unchanging, he actually is in his actual pole. That's why it says the actual pole. This is where he is actually. And basically the actual pole says that God is temporal, he's finite, he's changing. The actual pole is the physical universe. And the physical universe is actually his body. Okay? So panentheism, look at the words very closely. Pan means all, in means in theism. So literally it's all in God, God in all. So in other words, God is in the world much like soul is in the body. Much like your mind is in your brain. Okay, there's a relationship that's dualistic. There's a dipolar theism going on here. And if we look at this, it says God is in the universe like soul's in the body. And God and the universe are interdependent. And you want to remember that. You might want to even underline interdependent. So in other words, God and both his poles are interdependent. The one is holding up the other and vice versa. God grows, he learns and changes with history. Evil is seen as incompatibility within the universe. So their doctrine of evil isn't that evil is absolutely evil. There's no moral absolutes in panentheism. It's simply incompatibility. In other words, if you need a drink of water when you're out in the desert starving, you need this liquid to keep you hydrated. It is evil if you don't have it. It's good if you have it. But if you happen to be in the ocean or in a freshwater lake and you have all the water you need, then water is not an issue anymore. So the morals within panentheism actually vacillate and they evolve and they change along with God. This keeps going. So it's like if you're creating a mosaic and you are finishing your mosaic of Mount Everest. You've got just about your last piece, but there's a few pieces left over here, but they're the wrong colors. You can't fit them in. So evil to them is like misfit. It just is incompatibility. Those pieces might be used later and might fit in perfectly, but right now they're evil, so to speak. They don't fit God's growth at this point. Not that they're objectively evil, but they don't have any utility for what he's doing right now. That's the key thing to remember about the evil. Values change since God changes. The major figures: Alfred North Whitehead, Charles Hartshorne, Schubert Ogden, John Cobb, Lewis Ford. Now, let's do a contrast between panentheism and pantheism. Now, this is something that you want to keep filed away because it's easy to confuse the two. So let's put pantheism here and panentheism there. Okay? Remember, pantheism is God is all. Panentheism is God in all. Just that one little word can make the difference. Pantheism is ex deo, by emanation. Remember, the creation is ex deo. Panentheism could be either ex materia, that means out of pre-existing matter, or ex deo. Could go either way. And panentheism, God is impersonal. Okay, God is an it in pantheism. But in panentheism, God is personal. And you can call him a he. Pantheism, God is infinite. But in panentheism, what would you think God is? Finite. Okay, because his actual pole is changing and temporal. Pantheism, God is eternal. Panentheism, God is temporal, with only an eternal potential pole that he can be. Pantheism, God is unchanging. Panentheism, he's changing. Pantheism is actually what you call monopolar. There's only one pole, one God. Panentheism is bipolar or dipolar. Two poles, the actual and the potential pole. So keep in mind that little two letters, en, panentheism, to make the distinguishing note between those two views.
Out of matter, is that what you said?
Ex materia simply means out of matter or out of pre-existent matter. Okay? So matter was always there. And remember, in panentheism, God is not necessarily the creator. There is no creator in the literal sense of the word like we think God is the creator of the universe. He is what you call a world director, an orchestrator, a composer, much like the composer guides all the musicians. You know, he's kind of directing things and the flow of the music and the charts and the emphasis with the waving of his hands and the wand. Okay, you can find roots of panentheism going all the way back to Heraclitus. You can find it going back to Plato. Because remember, Plato had an interesting philosophy that you might be able to see some relationship here. Plato, has everybody got this chart? Are we okay? Plato was an interesting figure because he had many early elements of what we now know today in the modern times as like a panentheistic or a finite godism. When we talk about Plato, he lived in the 4th century BC. He was the student of Socrates. Plato also had a very young, bright student of his own named Aristotle. And then Aristotle, Plato's student, went along and tutored Alexander the Great, who conquered the known world by about 330 BC. So there's a strong lineage, but Plato was a fountainhead of a lot of the ideas that are now influence us today, the Greek world, and even the Jewish world during the time of Christ. Plato basically had what you call a demi-ergos. That's what he called God, basically. This was a finite, struggling, probably lower G God, not a capital G God. Struggling God. And what this demi-ergos would have to do is look at what you call the agathos. Or, what are you Greek scholars, what is agathos? The good. You'd have to look at the good. And this good had a bunch of forms here, or ideas. These eternal, unchangeable forms, the patterns, the exemplar causes of everything we see here in this material world. the demiurgos would view the agathos, or these forms, and the agathos would overflow with what you call eidos, or ideas. And this overflowing of ideas would stamp like a cookie cutter on the material world. But the only material world at that time, before the eidos came, was what you call a chaos, okay, an unordered universe. But once the eidos came from the agathos, through the viewing by the demiurgos, what do you think it produced? A cosmos. That cosmos, an ordered universe. And so Plato said, what we see in the cosmos today, materially, are like a shadow or a replica of the agathos, the forms up here in the good. These are eternal and unchanging. The cosmos had a shadow of those eternal, unchanging forms. But the shadows change. The shadows are imperfect. So there's always a degree of wanting to get back to the agathos in Plato. You can see how Buddhism could adopt this. Let's get back to the spirit world, so to speak, and let's do an end run around the material reality, since the material world to Plato was less real than the spiritual world. Subtle temptation to suicide, perhaps, here. Okay, let's get out of the material, stuck in the mud kind of existence and get back to the spirit here. Might be dangerous. Asceticism, perhaps, can be found as an implication of this. You know, forget the world. Let's go live in a monastery up on a hill, not rub elbows with the sinful flesh of the world here. Legalism, perhaps, trying to beat the body or flagellate yourself. Many of the Catholics, especially Martin Luther and some others, bought into this type of production. Allegoricism, trying to get back to the spiritual meaning. The forms may have come to esotericism, mysticism comes from here. Now, my point is, in bringing up Plato for the panentheism, is that this demiurgos is struggling. There's a finite effort to direct the world here. But it seems like in Plato that perhaps the agathos was the most important. You know, the small g God wasn't like the big deal. Okay, it was here that was the big deal, in the agathos, or the good, where the forms were. That's the crucial. But panentheism has much of a similar view in that the matter was eternal in that sense, and then there's this deity trying to form it and make it all he can be. So you have this potential pull in panentheism. They want to be, the God has this potential to be eternal and infinite. And he's like a struggling God to bring everything into order, or what he wants it to be. And then you have this kind of a bit of a dualism going on, and that's why we get panentheism. You know, Plato had a dualism going on because he thought matter was eternal, and also there was eternal spirit forms. So there was no connection between the spirit and matter. You know, they were like parallel things going on. No connection, so there was a problem.
Is there, at some point, can I ask the question, how do these various forms worship? I mean, did Plato actually have an active worship?
No.
It's just a philosophy.
Right. Remember this, Etienne Gilson wrote a book. It's called God and the Philosophers. And his basic thesis is that these philosophers, pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, Heraclitus, Anaximenides, Anaximander, Thales, they never got their first principle together with their worship. They never combined the worship of their first principle, whether it was water, air, fire, whether it was the agathos or the demiurgos. Plato never worshipped these. Okay? The worship of the first principle, or the first ultimate reality, came with a unique contribution from the Judeo-Christian concept. Okay, it's found in Exodus 3:14. God said, "I am that I am." That I am is the ultimate reality for both Judaism and Christianity. And Christians and Jews ended up worshiping their first principle. Okay? It wasn't the Greeks who worshiped their first principle. This was a unique contribution to the role of philosophy that Christians worship their first principle, so to speak.
Did they even understand, I mean, philosophically, did they ever even try to make a connection between that? Or did that come out of the Judeo-Christian?
There wasn't, remember, these guys are late. Plato's late. He's 4th century BC. I mean, the Hebrew Scriptures, Exodus, especially went all the way back to 14th, 15th century BC.
So they just walked away from that connection.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any connection between the Scriptures and the philosophers. At least nobody has done a thorough work on showing the connection between Scriptures of the Hebrews and the Greek philosophers like Plato or the early pre-Socratics in 586 BC. Nobody shows that Plato or Aristotle or these pre-Socratic philosophers ever read the Scriptures or were informed by them. There just doesn't seem to be any connection there. Though the early apologists like Justin Martyr, Anaxagoras, and some of these philosopher apologists, they would refer to Greek philosophy in their writings, but they would point back to Moses as to where perhaps Plato might have got his ideas of how the earth was formed, or Aristotle got the earth formed. So really, it's not Christians using Greek philosophy as an end-all, so to speak, in the early church. Those early apologists were actually giving credit to the Judeo-Christian tradition from what even the Greeks knew by general revelation. You know? Which I thought was a very fascinating notion coming from Gilson. That book is not that big. But if you can pick it up, go ahead and read that. Etienne Gilson, he's a French Thomist. That Gilson. God and the Philosophers. It's either God and Philosophy or God and the Philosophers. Now let's look at a few problems with panentheism. First of all, God can't be both infinite, and what does infinite mean? Without limits. In other words, he's independent being, doesn't need a cause, and finite. God cannot be both infinite and finite. Finite means you're dependent and contingent. You have limits. At the same time and in the same sense. Okay, so what they're doing is positing a somewhat of an infinite finite being here in this dipolar panentheism here. So you can't just blend up infinite and finite in a milkshake and expect to come out with something good in the end. What about the incarnation of Christ? Well, that differs because Christ was actually both infinite and finite. How? Well, his divine nature was infinite, and his human nature was finite. It had a birth, it had a beginning. It was killed on the cross, his human nature, and then resurrected 3 days later, that human nature. So remember, when we talk about Christ, you always got to ask two questions about him. One pertaining to his divine nature and the other pertaining to his human nature. In other words, did Christ get tired? Yes, in his human nature. No, in his divine nature. Did Christ die on the cross? Yes, in his human nature. No, you can't kill God as a spirit on the cross in a divine nature. So always ask two questions. I think some people, they combine the two and they fall into these contradictions or hard sayings and they can't get out of it. Two distinct natures in Christ. So panentheism, that although they would say that God is finite, infinite, at the same time, in the same sense, even though there's two poles, and even I need to even work that through even a little bit more. In what sense is that potentiality kind of a contradiction with the actuality of God? Because if it's merely a potential, perhaps it's really finite. So put a little asterisk by the infinite and finite. Why don't we say that God cannot be finite, period? Just go ahead and cross out infinite, because that would imply that he would need a cause of his finite being. And that way, we though I am unclear on between the infinite, because the infinite seems to be a potential, and a potential is not actual. I mean, it's an actual potential, but it's not an actual in the sense of his actual pole. So we'll do a little more research on that. And notice number 2. God cannot be dependent since he is a necessary being, or else we must find what God is dependent upon. Yeah. So any dependency, notice the mutual dependency. God is dependent on the universe is dependent on God. You know what that sounds like? It sounds like the foundation is holding up the house, and the house is holding up the foundation. And it doesn't seem to be a tenable way to go about it. Something has to be the cause of the foundation. It must be an unchanging, absolute cause or basis or foundation of why it's there. It can't be itself dependent on another. It has to be an independent, necessary being or cause to keep that up. God cannot guarantee final victory over evil. So there doesn't seem to be a plan in the panentheistic worldview for a final victory. Evil is just an incompatibility. He can use it some other time. And it's almost like God is growing in knowledge and changing at man's expense, perhaps. He's growing, he's learning from what's happening on the earth through the evils and through the goods. He is adding this to his knowledge base, and he's not forgetting it. So he's on his way toward that potential infinite knowledge and infinite and eternal, but he doesn't seem to will ever attain it, though, in the potentiality, in the panentheistic God, because it's an infinite potential, and how can you exhaust an infinite? It just keeps going and going and going and going and going. That means this evil is going to keeps going and going and going. There is no solution to ever end it, in other words. And fourth, God cannot change or else he is finite. We said that before. If you change, he's temporal. Change is measured in befores and afters. That's a category of temporalness and therefore needs a cause of its change. And you can add a 5 down here. Values can't change. Values are absolute. Values are absolute. You can refer back to the moral argument. 6th, potential can't actualize itself. This is a philosophical problem within panentheism. In other words, an empty water bucket can't actualize itself to be a full water bucket unless there's a cause that can actualize that. Wood can't build itself into a house. There has to be a cause adequate enough to actualize the potential of the wood to be in the house. What we have in panentheism, we have a finite actual pole actualizing an infinite potential. So he's actually actualizing his own being. You just can't do that. He has to appeal to somebody outside of himself who is an independent being, who's pure actuality, that doesn't need any potential to be actualized at all. So he can account for his own existence. But whenever you're made of act and potency, act is the fact that you are, that you have being. Potency is what you can be, or the potential. Every act, potency, being must have a cause of its being, because it has the potential not to be. That's what potency is, a potential not to be. If you have any potential, you have potential not to be. Human beings are act potency beings. Angels, act potency beings. The creation, the world, it's an act potency creation. Only God is pure actuality. I am that I am. He has no potentiality to be any smarter than he is, any less than he is, any greater than he is. He is purely actual at that. Any change in actuality, guess what? It's a change for the worse. Because how can you change from perfection? It's always a change for the worse. If you grow up in perfection, it implies you had a lack to begin with. If you go down in perfection, it implies a lack, because you no longer had what you did have. All right, let's move on to our last worldview, the 7th. Finite Godism. Notice that finite Godism, there's not many who hold this view today, perhaps in theory, but nobody systematically that I know of recently. However, in the past, the last generation or two, they have held it. John Stuart Mill, William James, who was the American psychologist, pragmatist. Notice what finite Godism is. A finite God that is active beyond and in the universe, but is limited in power. God is limited in his power, so it's a small g God here. Notice evil is real in a finite Godist universe. The universe is eternal, and you can trace this, again, back to Plato. What was his finite God's, what was he called? Demiurgos, right? Or the demiurge. Problems with finite Godism. God cannot guarantee final victory over evil. Again, he lacks the power to overthrow evil in the world. Lacks the power. You know, we're going to look at the problem of evil next time, and this is going to be a problem for finite Godists because there is no end to evil here either. There is no comfort to those who seek a solution. Secondly, if God is finite, how did they come to exist? Again, you have that causal problem. There is no root or ground of the finite being that this God has. And thirdly, the cause of the finite world must be infinite. Otherwise, it too would be a part of the finite world. The creator of time cannot be in time. And I want to hearken you back to our example about his attributes being in eternity, his effects being in time. His decrees from eternity, but yet they fall over through a chronology or a sequence of time. They fall out. In other words, he determined from eternity that this world would be created when it was. He determined from eternity that Christ would come to die for the sins of humanity. From eternity. Remember Acts chapter 2? He was given up by the predeterminate foreordination of God to them to be killed. Because it was his plan and his counsel from eternity, those actions fell out in time. Doesn't mean that God's in time. It just simply means his effects fall out in time. That's the key. Remember, time and eternity are very different. And time can be said, this is a big debate right now, and there's a lot of works written about it. But time perhaps is a mental measurement of befores and afters, or it's a mental measurement of change. That seems to be the prevailing view, but people have challenged that, especially in open theism. But eternity is different. The very nature of eternity is different because eternity is a simultaneous whole. There is no parts in eternity. There's no now and then. There's no before, present, or I shouldn't say present, but after. There's no past or future in eternity. It's all in a simultaneous now. So God's now is actually a stationary now. Whereas our now, and notice that we never live in the past or in the future, we always live in the now. Our now moves. Yeah, our now is transitional. It's moving through time here. But also time is made up of act and potency, just like everything else is. It's actually right now, but it's potentially the future. So is the future real? Well, yes, in one respect, and no in another. Yes, it's real in the sense that it's a real potential, and it's part of time, but no in that it's not actual yet. So that potential needs to be actualized. Okay, then on the next page you have the worldviews contrasted. This was inserted for your own perusal here, and it's quite exhaustive. You can go through that, and actually the next 2 pages after that is a restatement in a different form of what we already have been through, with a few more names added under each worldview. Okay, and a couple more verses thrown in there as well. And then you have the sources on page 34. These are all good books you can go look at. I didn't put in any systematic theologies in here, but there's a lot of theologies that you can look at as well about the nature of God and the different worldviews. You can just look under their theology proper area. And then tomorrow we'll go ahead and pick up with the problem of evil. Okay? All right, any questions on God and worldviews? God and worldviews. Those are so important.
Do you have a problem with evil?
Yeah, some have made a problem. Yes, evil is a problem, but it's not a problem in light of God's existence for the Christian. Yeah. Okay, let's just come before the Lord in prayer and ask Him to guide us and matriculate all that information. Dear Lord, we just thank you so much. We praise you. We ask that you would prepare our minds to assimilate the information, Lord, and to let it transcend not only the mind, but down into the heart, Father. And help us to be not only hearers of the word, but doers. Lord, give us that power through your Holy Spirit to move and to bring the message of your love and saving grace to the world. We just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, if you turn in your notes to the page right after page 34, we're going to look at the general theories of God's relationship to evil. We just went over yesterday the arguments for the existence of God. We had the cosmological, the teleological, the moral argument. We also had the argument from existential undeniability, which started with existence. And again, I want to just reiterate that though these arguments are not without their criticisms, there are very solid foundations for one to believe that God does indeed exist. Again, Paul's words in Romans chapter 1 makes it clear that through the evidence of the things that God has made, namely this universe or this earth, we can reason back to a creator. And though some may suppress that knowledge, evidently it is still there. And also we have the special revelation to make it even more clear. So now when we turn to the theories of God's relationship to evil, this is somewhat of a subset under the existence of God. So if you want to put existence of God as our second point in our overall apologetic for Christianity, put this as subpoint A underneath it, because it's the question most often asked. You know, if God exists, why are people still suffering in the world? Why does sin prevail? Especially in light of Christ's defeat of sin on the cross. It says that he triumphed over sin in Colossians, and that we have been translated from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his light, and that the substance of all these types and shadows of the Old Testament are found in Christ. But nevertheless, we still have evil present with us today. So that puts the Christian in a unique position to, try to ferret out what kind of relationship God has to evil, and if God has the power to ultimately destroy evil in a practical sense. And many Christians have posited that when Christ defeated evil on the cross, that he did it judicially. It was relationally and positionally that evil was defeated. However, practically speaking, people still sin. There's still evil in the world. We still have evil dictators and tyrants committing genocide around the world. So practically, defeated evil will come at his second coming in Revelation 19. And the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords will come on a white horse, followed by the saints. And it will be very interesting how that outplays. But when we talk about evil, this is the area of theodicy in theological terms. Theodicy. And it comes from two words, actually. If you divide the word in half, theo and dicey, you have God, and then the Greek word dike, or justice. We're justifying God's existence in light of the real presence of evil. Because if God is all-powerful, he can destroy evil. If he's all good, he will destroy evil. That's the problem we find ourselves. That's why we call this the problem of evil, is because there's been many who have launched arguments against Christianity based on this fact. Now, keep this in mind that there are two ways usually people deal with evil. One is to change God to accommodate for the evil in the world. God is either too weak to do anything about it, or God just turns a blind eye to it, or he's a malevolent God or a sadistic God that enjoys to see the privation and the pain in the world. And then there's a second way to deal with it, and that's change the nature of evil. So it's either change God or change evil to rectify the situation. Well, the Christian can do neither. He has to address the issue. We're not going to change evil, and we're not going to change God. God's going to be all-powerful, and evil is still going to be a very real thing here in the universe. So let's look it down on our page here and how some people have either changed God or changed evil. First of all, illusionism. We talked about that a bit yesterday under pantheism. Now, Parmenides, again, was that 5th century Greek philosopher that said there was no multiplicity, there was no otherness, all is one. Being is basically univocal. There is no distinction between this or that. And in that sense, he denied the reality of evil. There was no evil that could possibly come about, because evil implies a distinction from the one that he thought was one in totality. Then we have Zeno, who was basically an apologist for Parmenides. You've heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Well, those paradoxes in large part were written to justify Parmenides' theory on one being in the universe. We're all part of one being with no multiplicity at all. Also, Mary Baker Eddy in the West, we have her as the founder of Christian Science, who buys into the illusionist view that says evil is simply just an illusion. It's a figment of your imagination. So Mary Baker Eddy wouldn't deal with a problem if you're going through suffering. She wouldn't tell you to, okay, let's go take some medicine, or let's go get treatment for this, perhaps, if you're going through pain of cancer. She would just tell you to go to the reading room. And the reading room would help correct the error of the mind, because she bought into the illusionary aspect. That's why in Christian Science you have reading rooms. It's to get your mind in tune with what's going on, because it's really a figment of your imagination. Some forms of Buddhism, obviously evil is either illusory in Buddhism and Hinduism, or it is real in some respect, perhaps at least at these lower levels of reality, not at the highest level. But ultimately, Buddhism would get rid of the illusion simply by get rid of desire that we talked about yesterday. Remember dukkha? Remember what that meant? Suffering. You know, all life is suffering. That's part of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Very key aspect. And their ultimate goal is to get rid of that suffering through eliminating desire, then achieving nirvana, where you don't have to make these distinctions and suffer any of these illusionary evils. Notice the explanation here. Illusionism, when it pertains to evil, there is no extra mental reality of evil. It is defined in terms of imbalance, error of the mind, or illusory altogether. Now, dualism is another one. That's usually found in Zoroastrianism or Manichaeanism. You have the dualistic religious systems where you have that eternal principle of good and eternal principle of evil. They're constantly warring against each other. Notice the explanation here. Acknowledges the reality of evil in the world. In Zoroastrianism, it is understood in terms of eternal, never-ending cosmic struggle between the good, which is called the Ahura Mazda, it's not your car, and the evil, the Angra Mainyu. I can see these two cars driving down the street on the freeway antagonizing each other, the Mazda and the Mainyu, you know. But ultimately, dualism was back in the Persian areas. Of course, Augustine was part of the Manichaean cult, so he had some hang-ups on the problem of evil, but that led Augustine consequently to develop a whole system that dealt with evil. And the view that we're going to go over today is basically an Augustinian solution to the problem of evil. In fact, Augustine largely influenced Aquinas, who was Augustinian in his theology, though Aquinas was Aristotelian in his philosophy. So if you want to get some good books on evil, get Aquinas' On Evil. Also another good book is by Norm Geisler. It's called The Roots of Evil. There's other authors out there that have written on evil, like Voltaire wrote Candida, and that's C.S. Lewis writing The Problem of Pain. You can see his Surprise by Joy as well. It has to do with a little of a personal evil that touched his family and his wife. So moving from dualism, let's go to determinism. Plotinus and Benedict de Spinoza would be more of a determinist proponent. What does that mean? Well, it maintains that evil is real and that God had no other option available to his creative potential. Since God is a necessary being, his creation necessarily issues from him the same way ripples in a pond necessarily flow outward from a central point of contact. Now, this is a huge demarcation point from Christian God. Though God is necessary, remember we talked about him being a necessary being, capital N. He's a being that cannot not be. He must be, because he's the one who has to get the series going when we're talking about existence. But though he is a necessary being, he does not have to necessarily issue an action. In other words, he did not have to create. He did not have to do certain things that he made a choice to do. But Plotinus' God in determinism, and Benedict de Spinoza, that necessary being must necessarily emanate something. So though we say God is a necessary being, we do reserve the right to say that creation, for example, is not a necessary fact. He didn't have to create. He chose to create from eternity, and therefore implemented that effect at the moment and then instigated time right after that creation.
It's interesting that he made that choice, and in creating us, he also created us with opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. That opportunity is great. In fact, you hit on something, Stacy, because let's ask ourselves, why did God create? And we'll reserve the question of why did he create when he knew there was going to be evil? Okay, why did he create? I think the Westminster Catechism has a good answer to that. Basically, twofold reason: to glorify himself and to allow us to enjoy the world. So for his glory and our enjoyment seems to be a pretty good answer for creation, especially if you're a Christian and you've come into a relationship with Christ. You can enjoy things through a much pure lens and interpreting reality the way it is, knowing that God has sanctified the world in many ways through his Son Christ. Impossibilism is another option. Proponents there, you might want to put open theologians there in that, notice the explanation. Evil is real. God created the world freely along with creatures who possess freedom or self-determination. However, God did not and cannot know future contingent events. And that is one of the tenets of open theology. You can't know future contingent events. That means free creatures, you have to wait with bated breath, so to speak, and see what they're going to turn out to do. Therefore, it is impossible for God to know how free creatures would use their freedom. So you can't blame God, in other words, for the evil that occurs in the world. If he didn't know what they were going to do, because the future is a non-reality, and the open theologians say that God can't know non-reality. And now, I would just retort back to that, well, the potential does the future does exist as a potential, and it also exists in the mind of God, because everything that is first existed in his mind, and then it was created outward. So he can know the future without it actually being actualized at that point. Since God controls all things that are not free, it would be impossible to control every evil which springs from human freedom. So here you have a freedom issue involved in God's relationship to the subject. Impossibilism. It was impossible for him to know, therefore don't blame him for not doing anything about it. It's not his fault. Finitism is another view. William James, again, the American psychologist, pragmatist, John Stuart Mill, Charles Hartshorne, who is a process theologian. Finitism asserts that evil is real. However, God is limited in power or goodness and therefore cannot overcome it. So God here in the more of a panentheistic worldview in process theology says God just doesn't have the tools to deal with it. Malevolent. In fact, under finitism, what other worldview besides panentheism which worldview would fit under this view? We had panentheism, and there was at least one other one.
Is it pantheism?
No?
No.
Because pantheism would be probably up in illusionism here. It was the last worldview we went over. What was that? Yeah, finite godism. Yeah, finite godism would be placed under finitism. But God is just limited in power. He has no power to do anything about it or affect any change. The malevolent view. Some people call this the sadistic view. This is basically held by many disgruntled or emotionally angry, bitter Christians or non-Christians who are very bitter at God or at the Christian faith for some reason. And though this view is rare and perhaps held by emotionally scarred and disgruntled individuals, evil is viewed as real. God in some ways enjoys the privation, pain, suffering of his creatures. So you have the sadistic or the malevolent model that God really enjoys seeing people hurt because he's sovereign. He can do anything he wants, and that's kind of some of the kicks that he gets every once in a while, sitting back on his throne, smoking a cigar, so to speak, and kicking his feet up with the remote control, watching people go through their pain and suffering. So that's a malevolent God. How many times have you heard, why God, why have you done that? That bitterness that comes about when maybe a family member has cancer and dies. Or there's an accident that kills Johnny and Susie, or two little infant cousins, or something like that. That's a lot. And I know, Stacy, you're on the police chaplaincy there as a volunteer, and you see a lot of evil in the world. And that's one thing. You don't have to convince police officers and usually civil servants that evil is a reality. Definitely is there.
I've heard Satanists have this approach, or this view.
Satanists have the view of...
Actually, Satan is kinder than God. Because
yeah.
Whereas various
Yeah, that's a good point. Satanists perhaps see Satan as kinder than God, because what is the whole crux of Satanism? It's not necessarily the worship of the devil directly. It is the concept of selfishness. You know, the high holy day of Satanism is basically your birthday. And so Satan wants you to be all you can be in your flesh, so to speak. You know, basic premise to Satanism is do what you want, gratify yourself, exalt yourself, and don't hold back anything from yourself. Just as long as you don't hurt anybody else, just do what you got to do. Okay? But oftentimes that involves hurting other people, either directly or indirectly. And Satan is seen as the good guy because he's giving you the means by which to satisfy your own lustful desires. Then there's realism, to wrap it up here. Realism, that's Augustine, Aquinas, and usually classical theism. You can put evangelical Christianity under this view. Realism asserts that evil is a real lack, a corruption or a privation in good substances. Though Christ has defeated evil judicially, basically in his first coming on the cross and resurrection, God is an omnipotent and omnibenevolent being, or a kind being, can and will in the future defeat evil practically. Someone once said that Christ defeated evil with the cross in his first coming, but he's going to defeat it with the crown in the second coming. You know, the first coming, you have a positional switch. Positionally, he defeated and defanged the devil and defanged the effects of evil and power over our life. That's all about what justification, sanctification, and glorification is. I mean, justification, with regards to evil, removes the penalty of sin. It takes away that charge against you. The sanctification, in a nutshell here, deals with the power of sin over your life, or the power of that evil person, that evil temptation. And then the glory, or the glorification, deals with the presence of sin.
And the promise is that where would you put the sting of death being removed?
The sting of death being removed here, because it's and also basically here in glorification. In fact, you could all the way through. I mean, the whole salvation process that stops here. You're saved here, but then these are works that will come in the future that have nothing to do with salvation in a penal way. But it does have to do with salvation in growing you. Like, what does Paul say? I believe it's in Romans. You have been saved, and you will be saved, and you are saved, and continuing to be saved. Well, there's three different aspects of that salvation. So when somebody says, are you saved? Well, in what way? Finally? Glorified? No, not yet. We haven't got our resurrection bodies in the resurrection. You know, am I being saved right now in an ongoing process, as if a continuing action, a participle here? Well, yeah. Have I been saved in the past? Sure, absolutely. So that way you don't have a Catholic system where justification just runs headlong into sanctification and glorification. Because that way the Catholic Church will give you salvation as you go along through life, as long as you meet the requirements. That's right, that's right. Somebody said they get you from the grave, or from the birth cradle to the death grave, because you have infant baptism in the beginning, then you have the extreme unction, ablution in the end. So keep that in mind as well. So realism is within evangelical Christianity. And notice the lack, the corruption, or the privation of good substances. We're going to start talking about that on the next page. So if you turn your page, we'll develop that thesis a bit more. The problem of evil. Now, there's been different arguments launched against Christianity with regards to evil. And let me say this, that the Bible has statements that appear to be in conflict with each other, and put an underline under the word appear to be in conflict. They really aren't really. Genesis 1 says God created the earth and it was good. He created the sun and the light and the stars and the moon and the animals, and finally he created man and he pronounced them good. each time. So over and over it was good, 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 all the way down through. So go ahead and count up those words good next time you read Genesis 1. You'll find that material creation is not evil. It's a very good thing.
Or the origin of man is good too. I mean, you can't argue with the other side, which a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm.
But we had to fall from somewhere.
Right.
And
That's right.
we're not sin-based, we're good-based along with creation. And then
Mm-hmm.
Paul said in Romans that this creation had to be subject to
Yes.
in order for
That's
our
right.
equal good.
Yes, we started good, and metaphysically in our material body, we still are good in that sense. Christ has sanctified it, and material never was evil, and it never will be evil. It came from God's hand, and it can't be. But there is some that came from God's hand that can be due to a certain perfection that He gave us, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But the Bible, again, does go through establishing that the material nature is good. The epistles tell us that to the pure, all things are pure. Romans 14, Paul says, nothing is unclean in and of itself. And we have, then again, you have Isaiah 45:7 that says, I am the Lord, I create evil and good. I am the person that creates both of these things. So how do we reconcile a good creation along with the evil, apparently evil instances that perhaps come from God? And remember, that's an apparent. So notice the first argument here, the problem. This is an argument against the Christian concept of God and evil. They say basically, if God can create only good and perfect things, how then can evil come from what is totally perfect and good, whether it be from God or His created order? Now that's interesting, because you might want to underline the word perfect, because remember, an all-good God, a perfect God, can only create something that is good. He cannot possibly create something that's evil, because remember, He has no potential to be evil. He's pure actuality. What was that, Greg?
It's contrary to His nature.
Yeah, it's totally contrary to His nature to create something evil. He couldn't have created Satan the way he is now, initially. He had to create him good in the beginning. His name was Lucifer. So, but one of the perfections God gave human beings was free choice. He gave Lucifer free choice. He gave the angels free choice. He gave Adam freedom to do what he wanted to do. And by virtue of God putting that tree in the middle of the garden that says, don't eat of this tree, eat of all of the other trees except this, implies that there is a moral obligation and a choice present within Adam. And so the argument actually brought against Christianity can be put in a syllogism, and it can be like this. Every creature God made is perfect. Perfect creatures cannot do the imperfect. Therefore, every creature can't do what is imperfect, or they can't do an evil. Well, like we said, though, one of the perfections God gave these creatures in the beginning was freedom. And look at the proposed solution here. Though it is true that God initially created everything good, one of the faculties God created in man was the ability to freely choose. Therefore, evil resulted as a byproduct or a concomitant of man's freedom, such as God is an indirect cause of evil, since He created man only with the potential for evil. However, man is the immediate cause of evil, since He made evil realizable. Now, when we look back to Lucifer and Adam, there was two things they had in common. Now, if I put Lucifer's name here on the board, there's only so many options you have that could account for why he sinned. What is one option? God could have made him sin. Okay, but God does not tempt, nor is He tempted, and He doesn't cause evil, James 1 says. There's no way that God could have tempted Lucifer or somehow made him sin in an evil way like that. It's just not of the nature of God. God has to exist and be and do in accordance with His own being, which is perfectly good. Well, there's a second option. Who else? What's that? Okay, his pride. We're going to save that for number 3. Why don't we just put his pride here? But how about the angels? That's another option you could choose. What about his fellow angels that were created alongside him? Did they determine him to sin? Well, if they determined him to sin, you really haven't removed the problem, because you have to account for why they sinned. And then who's going to force them to sin? So there seems to be a freedom implicitly in Lucifer. That seems to be the only choice. So you can put pride / freedom. You know, they say that evil originated in the bosom of an angel. That's how the saying goes. Well, they're talking about Lucifer here. So really the only option is Lucifer exercised his own free moral self-determination to choose whether he wanted to be following God or not following God. We know it wasn't God. We know it wasn't the angels because that removes moral responsibility, and we have to still account for how those angels could be evil to tempt Lucifer. So really the only other option is freedom and Lucifer. In fact, you can put Adam in place of Lucifer. Well, who made Adam sin? Was it Lucifer who had already sinned by the time Adam sinned? Because Lucifer fell by that time. Remember the snake, the hiss in Genesis that talks about hath God said? Well, was it God who made Adam sin? Was it Lucifer that forced Adam to sin? Well, no. It couldn't have been. How could Adam be morally responsible if the devil made me do it, so to speak? Yeah.
I don't know if this will unfold that two-part
Yeah.
question. Do strict Calvinists subscribe to this point of view? And my secondary part of the question is, how do you resolve this free will with Romans, where we're not free will, we're under the bondage of sin, and we don't have free will?
That's a great question. Yeah, Kirk. What do we do? First of all, two-part question. Do the Calvinists hold this kind of view? And what do we do with the Romans passage that says we are in bondage to sin? And neither can the mind please God, the carnal and the fleshly mind. It's like locked up in this sinful state. Well, number one, yes, Calvinists believe that Lucifer had freedom in the beginning, and so did Adam. Everybody's in a concert there. There's no difference. There's no debate there. The only question is, what happened after Lucifer sinned and Adam sinned? What was the nature of their depravity after? The Calvinist would say that the door swings one way. Before they sinned, both Adam and Lucifer, they could choose either for God or against God. They had that ability. After they sinned, they can only choose to disobey God at that point. That's where the departure comes from both moderate Calvinists and Arminians. Okay, the Arminians and moderates say, though yes, we are depraved, the depravity is extensive, not intensive. Okay, that means basically that the Calvinist view of depravity means that that ability to choose God on a vertical plane has been destroyed. Okay, you can choose evil because you are in bondage to evil. And so you choose necessarily evil. You're in bondage to it. When you're in bondage to it and you're totally depraved like that, that's the only thing you can do. So they would follow Jonathan Edwards' view of the freedom of the will in that you do what you desire. And since you only desire evil, you do evil. Okay, that's how the Calvinist would probably answer that. The moderate Calvinist, on the other hand, which is kind of a halfway house between Calvinism and Arminianism, says, yes, the door could swing both ways before they sinned, when they had their free choice, and it could swing both ways after they sinned, because depravity is not intensive, destroys your ability to vertically choose. It is extensive. That means that the depravity went to every part of your being, your willing, your mind, your body. Everything is affected by this sin. However, it didn't destroy your ability to receive Christ through the conviction of the Holy Spirit. Now, the Holy Spirit's role in this is important too. Okay, the Calvinist would say that the Holy Spirit's role is to regenerate the person so they can believe. The moderate Calvinist says that the Holy Spirit persuades the person to believe. There is no regeneration to believe or to have or exercise faith, but there's actually a persuasion going on. And the Calvinist would, and I'm making a distinction between Calvinist and moderate Calvinist. So Calvinist is the first topic I'm talking about. The Calvinist would say that the Holy Spirit has very strong, if not compulsion or coercion. Okay? It has to be, salvation comes from the Spirit. The moderate would agree in that salvation must come from the Spirit. John 1:12 and 13 is perfectly clear in Romans 8:9. He who is without the Spirit is none of his. And nobody comes to God without the Spirit. However, the moderate Calvinist says that it is not a coercion or perhaps a compulsion. It is actually a strong persuasion, the strongest persuasion you can have to allow the freedom to go both ways. So moderate view believes in freedom, vertical freedom and horizontal freedom. The Calvinist view prior to salvation believes in horizontal freedom, it appears, and then the vertical freedom would come only after regeneration, so they can exercise faith. The Arminian view would probably follow more or less in the moderate Calvinistic view. However, with that being said, the Arminian view of the depravity of man as it relates to whether he can choose after sinning, after evil has occurred, is less than the moderate view. Okay, so both the moderate Calvinist and the Calvinist are more Augustinian in their view of sin. The Arminian says, yes, it's extensive, the sin permeates the whole person, but yet the guilt of Adam does not destroy your willing. So the will largely remains unaffected in the Arminian system. But both in the Calvinist and the moderate Calvinist, the will is definitely affected in both views. Okay? I don't know if that...
The bondage of the will goes back to Luther's, right?
Yes, the bondage of the will goes back to Luther. And then you had Calvin's writings on the more stronger limitation of freedom. And the early Augustine, just know this, that Augustine changed his views during his life. Before 417, he was largely more the moderate Calvinist view. At the end of his life, after 417, he largely adopted the Calvinist view. Okay? Because remember, who was Augustine's archenemy? Pelagius. Okay? And the Pelagian system of sin didn't believe in original sin. And Augustine is saying, hey, yes, original sin is part and parcel of what is happening here. That's why we need redemption. Pelagius didn't acknowledge that original sin at all. So the Arminian view would be a lot closer to the Pelagian view or semi-Pelagian view than Augustine in the moderate and the Calvinist view. Okay.
Because they're very close in our evangelical
Yes.
systems,
Right.
It would be easier for us to visualize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You can just lay them right out. In fact, we can try to fill in a chart if you'd like, and to see if we can ferret out some of these subtle distinctions. Without getting into the tulip, that is the 5 points of Calvinism created under the canons of Dort in about 1618 in response to the remonstrance of Arminius' followers. And we're talking about T in this tulip, total depravity. And let's put up here the Calvinist here. We'll put up the moderate Calvinist here. We'll put up the Arminian here. And we'll just kind of keep them separated. The Calvinists, when it comes to total depravity, remember, total depravity is intensive, and that means that it is not, don't get this wrong, when I say intensive, when I say it destroys part of an individual, I want to use that word, but don't think it destroys the image of God. I don't think there's any Calvinists that believe that the image of God is destroyed. However, with that being said, though, intensive destruction means that the image of God, in some respect, at least as it has to do with the will, the freedom of the will, has been separated from the person. So you can diagram that like this, since we're not going to use the U, L, I, and P in the tulip here. You have the I, you have the image of God here, and you have God here. There's a separation between all three of these concepts, to where God must regenerate the individual to take away this center divider so he can now choose again. But the image of God is not destroyed. The intensive destruction of the will, vertically speaking, or to choose God, has been irreparably damaged unless the Holy Spirit is going to work to regenerate the person so they can believe. Okay? When we come to the moderate view, the depravity is extensive. That means it's extended to every part of the human being. That the mind, the will, the effects of sin, nothing escapes. Everything. But remember, the extensiveness, instead of there's an image of God separated from the I or the ego and from God, the extensiveness basically says that we have a strong propensity, an inclination, a leaning, a bent, whatever you want to call it, a very strong one that affects the way we decide and the way we think. Though it is possible for someone to vertically receive or to choose God after a persuasive work of the Spirit. Okay. And then the Armenian view, it would be partially, I'm going to put P here, partially extensive because it extends to the whole part of man, except perhaps Adam's guilt does not extend to the willing faculties of the individual. It's more of like a semi-Pelagian. Yes, there is original sin in the Armenian view. It's not Pelagian altogether, but it's partially extensive because it doesn't seem to affect the will. The guilt and the damaging effects of sin are just not there. So they leave the will wide open, almost as it was prior to the fall. Okay, it's wide open. So I hope that ferrets out the depravity issue as far as sin goes. How do we remedy the depravity? Well, the Calvinist would say there's irresistible grace. That's the I here in the tulip. Irresistible grace. That if the Holy Spirit works on you, you will come to the Lord. There's no doubt about it. And that irresistible grace will cause the regeneration, and then the person may exercise his faith. In the moderate view, it's they would say that it's irresistible only on the willing. That if you're willing to fall in love, so to speak, much like a marriage, if you're willing to be loved and to love your spouse, then it will lead to a marriage. And that's how the moderate says, that there's a persuasive work, not an irresistible work by the Spirit. There's a wooing, so to speak. There's a drawing, like a dating, a courting relationship prior to marriage, when you're about to marry your spouse. So if you allow yourselves to fall in love, you will. The Armenian, again, would say that there's persuasion, definitely not irresistible grace, but there's a persuasion going on, and ultimately you can choose to either receive it or reject it. How secure are you after you've received it or reject salvation? Well, the P for the Calvinist is perseverance of the saints. All the people who accept God will make it to the end, but you're going to have to wait to the end to see who really were the elect. Okay, they don't spill the beans all at once. Bated breath there. And then the moderate Calvinist believes in eternal security. They believe that basically people can die and still go to heaven in a backslidden state. If they die in sin, but they've been saved, they're still going to heaven. Whereas the Calvinist that believes in perseverance of the saints, they believe that no truly elect person will die in a sinful state. Okay, and the Armenian, they don't believe in perseverance nor in eternal security. They would believe that you can get on and off the salvation bus, so to speak. It goes throughout life, that you can reject it and walk away from it and then come back to it. So you can get on and off salvation if you wanted to. Yeah.
There's got to be another call in there. I'm sorry.
Where?
There's got to be another call.
Oh, in between somewhere here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Between the Armenian and the moderate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it's just...
yeah, maybe there is, Kurt.
Personally, because I'm
Yeah.
not in either camp. I'm not in
Yeah.
any three of those. I'm kind of...
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Pick and
really
pull a little bit.
in the extreme Calvinists at
Mhm.
all. I'm really... Well, really. But I mean, I got kind of feet in both camps of the moderate. And
Kind of somewhere in here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
It
some...
seems so practical, the Armenian. It seems so practical.
Yeah.
Workable.
Well, it does.
And the Calvinist is so hard.
Well, that's what I mean, yeah, I'm more in the Armenian, except for I believe in the eternal security and salvation piece,
Mhm.
where I don't get on and off the bus. I mean, I'm on the bus, there's nothing I can do about it, but I
Mhm.
firmly believe I can get in a backslidden state.
Right. Okay. So, you might be somewhere in here, maybe more in the moderate camp, since you're probably over in this area, if we're going, if we're putting here. Because the Armenian, just think about this. Remember, predetermination and foreknowledge has to do with salvation. The Armenian would say that God looks down the corridors of time, sees what the individual will do, and then bases his election on that vision or on that knowledge. So therefore, you have God's knowledge being dependent upon what he's seen to base his election. So that's one of the criticisms of a far Arminian view, that God's knowledge can't be dependent on anything. That means that salvation is basically dependent upon God knowing what you will do. It makes you the heavy in salvation and the basic bearer of it. So that's one criticism here. The moderate view has been criticized in that they have perhaps borderlined on semantical fine distinctions that perhaps aren't even really there. Intensive, extensive, eternal security to perseverance of the saints. Some have. However, I would probably put my check mark in the moderate view here. Probably half to over here, if you would. But I definitely wouldn't be in the Arminian camp because of the eternal security issue and the basis of the election that they have. Because I know that God, as an independent being, cannot base or be dependent on anything in order to do his predetermination and ordination. It has to be rooted in God alone. And these two views hold that. Calvinist and moderate Calvinist hold that distinction very tight. In fact, if you read theology proper in both these two camps, you're going to find that they're strong on theology proper, on God and this determination. So people involved here, you have Arminius, of course, involved here. I think there's Watson is a theologian over here. J.P. Moreland, J.P., you've heard of him, right, at Biola University. William Lane Craig would be in the Arminian camp, over in this area. Moderate Calvinist, I'm going to put here the early Augustine, prior to 417. You have Geisler in this camp. You have Ryrie, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, from Dallas Seminary is in there. The Calvinist camp, you have the late Augustine. Late Augustine here, that's after 417, where he changed his views quite a bit. You have Louis Berkhoff, perhaps W.G.T. Shedd, Wayne Grudem, some modern theologians here. The Calvinist theory is basically from Augustine up to the Reformers. Now you put more of a Lutheran here and a John Calvin here as well, under the Calvinistic model. From about 417, where Augustine reigned, all the way up to the Reformers, about the 16th century, you really don't have much of Calvinism going on. There's like an absence. So if you go look at a book that talks about the history of Calvinism, they'll start with Augustine usually, and then they'll pick up again in the Reformation. You won't have that. But in large part, it was both kind of a combination between the Arminian and the moderate Calvinistic view in the early church and up through the Middle Ages. And then it began to change again in the Reformation period.
Well, isn't Sproul in the Calvinist?
Yes, R.C. Sproul would be in the Calvinist camp.
He kind of touts his holiness thing, or being holy at least, that at times comes across like you can slip out of your salvation.
Uh-huh.
The story goes, he left his home and frantically traveled to a dying friend's house.
Uh-huh.
And to be sure that he confessed Christ at the last minute, because if he's afraid if he hadn't, he would lose his salvation.
Yeah.
In that case,
So this
it's
is
Arminian,
a
not
contradiction.
Well, yeah, if somebody's worried about losing their salvation, it would be more of an Armenian construct. Yeah.
Would be there.
I don't know about R.C. I don't know about the story that you're talking about, but I do know that he would find himself in the classical camp. He would be a classical
I would really go along with
apologist.
the idea of perseverance, I think. You gotta be persevering up to the last.
Okay, well, that's where it comes in then.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're truly elect, you'll persevere
Yeah.
to your dying moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but,
Truly elect, you don't have to
but is he
persevere.
saying you will persevere? If you're truly elect, you will persevere.
You'll demonstrate by your perseverance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
No works there.
Okay, so
it's tough.
the reason for our chart was to understand depravity and how it relates to the various theological positions. Just to get this back to what we're talking about here.
This is one of our favorite topics. Can you tell me?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be for a long time. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to work out these mysteries, and it's quite interesting. But I have some great appreciation for all three of these views, because they all bring something to our awareness about God, about depravity, and about His love for us in one respect or another. Even if you don't put your hat in absolutely one position here, maybe you pull from a few and see how you can make that relate in a coherent way.
You have to really work on not making it a divisive issue, because it can be, because there's a lot of ramifications on believing one extreme or the other.
Yes.
Especially between fellow Christians. I mean,
right.
Just where you are in your own Christian walk has a lot
Yeah.
to do with your
Sure.
perspective there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can be divisive. That's why it's so key to just, if you win a debate on this issue, does it mean salvation? I'll tell you what, when we get to heaven, I know there's going to be Arminians there. I know there's going to be moderates, and I know there's going to be Calvinists there. So that's the key thing. I mean, let's debate, but let's not divide over that issue. Now, you can, getting back to our source of evil, there's a couple distinctions I want to make. First of all, notice the last two sentences. It starts with, as such, God is the indirect cause of evil, since He created man with the potential for evil. So can we say that God is the indirect cause of evil? Yes, because He permitted evil in the beginning. He gave the potential by giving freedom to people in the beginning with Adam and Lucifer. So He knew of the potential, but you don't blame Him simply because He permitted it, any more than you'd blame Henry Ford for bank robberies and getaway cars and hit-and-run accidents and drunk driving accidents and accidents that take human life. Right. He was the indirect cause of these accidents by creating the potential for them to happen. He simply permitted them to happen in that sense. So every time we see an accident on the news, we don't go back to Henry Ford going, that guy, I want to get him, But maybe some people do, but I don't think it would be warranted to do that. Now notice the distinction in the last sentence. However, man is the immediate cause of evil, since he made evil realizable. Everybody in the both Calvinist, moderate, and the Arminian camp believes that man is responsible for their sin. None of these camps say that God is responsible for man's sin. They may have different reasons as to why man is responsible and different arguments against each other, but ultimately every one of them believes man's responsible, not God. Notice the difference between the immediate cause. The immediate cause is the proximate, or the cause that happens here and now. Okay, that's man's. So the sinful or the evil desire and action stemming from man originates and comes from him, himself. All three of the views agree to that point. But the primary cause you can call God in an indirect sense. And we're going to do another chart here. Let's move on to the second one. The substance or the nature of evil. So where did evil come from? We concluded that it came from freedom that God gave the people. Now we're looking at the substance, the nature. What is evil? That's the question. And notice the argument against Christianity here. It says, if God directly created every spiritual and material substance, and evil is either spiritual or material, then God created evil. Therefore, God is to blame for all evil. Now, if you want to put this in a tight syllogism, basically it's God is the author of everything. Evil is something. Therefore, God is the author of evil. So the dilemma here is that if God is the creator of everything that is, how do you get Him off the hook for the creation of evil? Something He can't do, according to Christians, as an all-good and all-powerful God. Okay, notice the solution here. Though God created all spiritual and material substances, it has yet to be demonstrated that evil is a substance possessing materiality or form nature like those found in humans or angels. In other words, evil is not like this desk that has atoms and molecules. Like, give me 3 ounces of evil, please. No, it's not going to happen, because evil isn't boiled down to the material nature. More precisely, according to Augustine, evil is a lack and absence or corruption of what ought to be present in good substances. Therefore, evil has no existence in itself, but its existence is similar to a parasite in a good host. You can see on his Morals of the Manichaeans in Book 5, number 7. So basically, the Augustinian view seems to be the tenable view for Christians at this point, because it says basically it's a lack in something. It's an absence of what could be there. It's a privation. In other words, it's like rust to a car. It's an absence of good metal there. It's rot to a tree. If you had a t-shirt folded up in your drawer and you had holes in it, well, the absence of cloth there would be considered an evil. It's a lack of what ought to be present. Now, with that being said, we can say evil truly is a corruption. And then with that also being said, what would you say if I said, well, rocks are evil because they lack eyes. They're privated of eyes. They can't see. Does that mean material creation is evil? How about clouds? They don't have a mind. They lack a mind. They have a privation of mind. Therefore, clouds are evil. What are we trying to say here with this?
Evil wasn't inserted in the material creation.
Right. Evil was not inserted in material creation. That's true. That is very true. But how do we get off the hook? Because obviously if we adopt that view, we're going to have to say the material creation is evil because it lacks a lot of things that human beings have.
Choice definitely not.
Okay, let's say a rock lacks choice.
The spiritual world,
Mm-hmm.
the spiritual world has no need, but the physical world has need. Since we're constantly choosing between whether to fear or not to
Mm-hmm.
fear, for the lack of things we need, we often choose.
So based on maybe spiritual
out of
need or
faith,
material
out
need,
of lack of faith, we
lack of faith,
choose evil.
we choose evil out of lack of faith. Okay, but how does that answer the problem with rocks not having eyes or a zebra not having a human hand? It lacks those things. It's privated of those things. So how can we refrain from calling that zebra evil? Because this is the retort back to us. When we say that evil is a lack of corruption in the good or an absence of what should be present, we are charged with those things. Well, rocks don't have eyes, so they must be evil. They're lacking those things.
Might just be limited to man, which is the made image of God. Everything else, by definition, doesn't have those things.
That's true. That's true. You're onto something there, Kirk. And I think you've hit the outer edge of the bullseye there. Basically, remember this, that rocks, although they don't have eyes, they never should have eyes in the first place. So our concept of evil says it's a lack in what ought to be present. Okay? Eyes ought not to be present in rocks, nor a hand on a zebra, nor a mind in a cloud. So therefore, those things are existing according to their own mode of creation and own mode of being. All right? Or else we could reverse it, couldn't we? Couldn't we say, well, our mind lacks rockness? You know, sometimes my wife says I'm a rock in the head and I don't get things. It just bounces right off. And that's probably true. But we'd have to say that we were evil in the sense that we lack rockness or hardness in that manner. But it shouldn't be present in our minds in the first place. Yeah.
I don't know if this is philosophical.
Uh-huh.
Just talking about spiritual material substance, when you talk about something like the mind, where do you put that? I mean, that's not material.
Right.
Is that not really spiritual?
That's a good point. What about when you talk about immaterial entities like angels or demons or mind or spirit? Well, there can be a lack in proper relationship to God in the soul. A lack can take the terms not only in a physical, that's the way we can illustrate the example of what we're talking about, but a lack in proper relationship to God in the soul is what Adam had when he sinned. He physically was separated, he died spiritually. And that lack or that hole in the soul is the privation or the absence of the good or what ought to be there. We ought to have a good relationship with our Creator. But when it's not present, there's an evil, and we've got to overcome that evil through the work of Christ on the cross.
What do you do, though, in the argument of if you've got somebody who is not acknowledging that that is what ought to be present? I mean, we're saying it is a lack of what ought to be present. But maybe I can say, well, why does that have to be present?
Mhm. Why does that have to be present?
Why does there have to be goodness? Why
Right.
does there have to be morality?
Well, any person, that goes back to moral absolutes, any person that says that they ought not have title to their car, to their possessions, and when they see it stolen, run to the police station because that's not right, that's not just. There's a lack of something that ought not to be present there. Basically, they should have ownership of their car shouldn't be destroyed. So though they may deny it verbally, they practically live as though there is a real evil involved. Especially when a family member dies. What do? Cry. They weep. They're emotionally hurt. They're perhaps devastated in some respects. They have a loss. Well, whenever there's a loss, that means there's a lack or a privation of something. And that's why you can call hell a lack and privation of a proper relationship to God. And that is the epitome of evil. That is evil working out and gone to seed for eternity in that respect. There's never a proper relationship there to each other horizontally or to man. So I hope that touches on what you meant, Greg, about...
I'm playing devil's advocate because
Sure.
some people that just say, we've talked about this already, about all bets are off.
Right.
Who says it has to be that way?
Yeah.
But you're right. The first time there is a loss in our humanity, the first thing we do, whether we verbalize it or not, is we blame something supernatural. We blame
Right.
God because we know it's out of our control.
Right.
Somebody has snuffed life and
That's right.
so they start looking for that.
That's right. And think of it this way. If you look at the objection that this person would bring up, Greg, they say, oh, well, why it ought to be good, or there's no such thing as a lack or a privation in my soul, and this and that. Well, what if you said, well, I think your argument is lacking? They would say, no, it's not. Okay? Because they know that if their argument is false, it would be lacking something, maybe intelligence or something else like that, and it would definitely be an evil. So kind of the laws of logic kind of militate against that particular view because there's an opposite to that concept. But maybe a chart for you guys might help clarify the substance and the nature of evil. Now, since evil is a lack or a privation in the good, we have to say that God is the author of evil in one respect. Basically, He permits it. And He is not the author of evil in another respect. Evil is a privation or a lack of the good. In Isaiah 45, I believe, verse 7, says, I am the creator of evil. Well, that Hebrew word ra there doesn't mean that He is the creator of evil in the sense of moral perversity. Many translations actually translate it, He's the creator of calamity or of plagues, like in Egypt in Pharaoh's time. So let's try to ferret out how God is the author and not the author. He is the author in the sense of calamity. Calamity. Most Bibles now translate that verse in Isaiah 45, verse 7, as calamity. But He is not the author of evil in terms of sin. Man is the efficient cause of evil. He is the originating cause of evil. God is the author of evil when it comes to non-moral issues. Because remember, God did not determine that evil would occur, nor did He determine that it would not occur. He determined to permit it to occur. So in that sense, you don't have God's to the blame. God is not the author of evil in the term of moral issues. He does not author evil in the sense of murder or rape or molestation. God is the author of evil in terms of plagues. He is not the author of evil in terms of perversity. He is the author of evil in an indirect way. How might that be?
He gave man freedom.
Right. He gave man freedom, and from that freedom, as a byproduct, is the potential for evil to occur. Good. And He is not the author of evil in a direct way. God is not the one doing the raping. He's not the one doing the stealing nor the murdering. It's not coming from his hand. Possible. He makes evil possible. So in that sense, he's the author of evil. But he is not the author of evil in the sense of making evil actual. Man uses that willer of his to make those actual. God permits evil, but he does not promote evil. Now, this is a great chart. I want to try to remember this one day. It's, I believe it's Norm Geisler's chart from his, what book is that? The Roots of Evil. Good chart.
How would you respond, and I know we've talked about this, but when you talk, if I were to demonstrate this for an unbeliever who is wrestling with issues of sin, the question that has come up and frequently comes up is, well, if God is God of love, why does he even make it potential? Why in fact does he permit it? And then you go back into the free choice issue as well, or whatever. But how would you respond to somebody who is totally skeptical about this, and they're saying, well, why is there even a provision for evil?
Okay, let's go over the options God had, perhaps. Why did God even make a provision for evil? Well, some say that you can't have moral responsibility without that potential to choose one way or another. You know, God could have only made mechanical robots, automatons, if you will, that would just pull the string on the back of their back and it says, I love you, I love you, I love you, God. And you just pull the string again, and the same words come out. And there's no meaningfulness in the relationship between the creature and the Creator. So one say moral responsibility is the key issue there. The second option God could have had was he could have created a non-moral world. Okay? He could have created a world where moral issues were not a factor. Well, maybe that's possible. You still fall into the problem of a moral responsibility and the meaningfulness of love, genuine love, being directed. However, just think about this. The objection assumes that a non-moral world is what? Is morally better than a moral world. So it really is a circular argument, or at least it defeats itself, because they're assuming that this is more moral than a moral world. Okay, so they find themselves in the dilemma back where we started. 3, he could have created creatures that sinned, but all were saved. You know, he could have created creatures that would sin, but he would guarantee that all were saved. That's universalism. But if he guaranteed that all were saved, he would have to, again, perhaps force one into a relationship that they may not want to be a part of at that point. So they could create them with freedom. They sinned, but then ultimately he would just gather everybody up in the end. And we'd have to question the moral responsibility issue again. He could have created no world at all. Right? Forget it. Just forget it. I know that some are going to be in hell and some in heaven, but I'm going to just forget the world issue. But this implies that nothing is better than something. Nothing is never better than something because nothing is nothing. It can't be compared. So what I'm saying here is very important on number 4, because this means that some people in heaven and some people in hell is better than no people in heaven and no people in hell. Something is better than nothing. That's why we play championship sports. Even though we know there's going to be a loser in Super Bowl or Wimbledon, the ability to risk, to love, to have the potential, even though it's risky, to